Racial relations, for example, are quite different. In the case of the French, the intermarriage in general in French colonies with the natives was more permissible, if I may put it this way, than it was in the case of the British, Right? So that has consequences as well for things like what is the nature of stratification in that society. Was there then, if you're looking at systems of governance, was there a greater system of centralization? One would have to move into those questions. Yeah. So, what did you all think of the exam? No surprises. I think you would agree, right? From my standpoint, a spectacularly easy exam because, it's take-home. Orientalism, I spoke about it clearly. If you hadn't read the text, all you had to do was go listen to the lecture and then go to the text. And is it working now? Yeah. Okay. All right. So, as I said, I think a rather easy exam, but I think this exam indicates to you, as I pointed out on a number of previous occasions, that I'm not going to ask you about a particular individual or a particular phenomenon. Of course, when you answer the question, you may have to. So, let's say that one of the questions had to do with what was the way in which the British transformed India. Give a number of illustrations drawn from the economic domain, political domain, social domain, legal domain. So let's supposing you mentioned the permanent settlement as an illustration. So when you talk about the permanent settlement, then you are talking about something concrete, but that's precisely what it is. It's an illustration of a larger argument. But you're certainly, and in the final exam as well, you certainly will not get a question about which would ask you, well, describe the life and times and policies of Lord Dalhousie, for example, right? You're going to get questions that are going to be much more encompassing in their sweep. So what you got in this exam, I think, furnishes some clues about the kinds of questions you might get on the final exam, all right? Now, I want to take a little bit time to wrap up my discussion on the social life of the British in India, kind of a social history of the British in India. We will return to this subject when we look at E.M. Forster's novel, which will be a couple of weeks from now. If you have not started reading that novel, please do so now. Do not look upon it as a chore or as an obligation, because it is a marvelous novel. It's a marvelous novel, not without its difficulties. All works have their difficulties, but Forster was a master of English prose. He also lived in India for a period of time. In fact, he acted as the private secretary to one of the Maharajas, one of the native rulers. There's a little book he wrote called The Hill of Davy. And he was one of the supreme essayists in the English language of the 20th century. So it's a novel that I'm certain you will enjoy, particularly if you have an ear for irony. It's extremely ironical, and the characters are fleshed out in a most interesting way. So when we look at that novel, we're looking at this whole question of the social life of the British, racial relations, and the element that I've discussed in this class several times before and is worth reiteration at this juncture is the fact that racial relations had certainly begun to decline between the British and Indians by the 1820s, 1830s. When we move to the rebellion later today, the rebellion of 1857, 1858, there can be no question, no doubt, that deteriorating racial relations was one of the many reasons why the country, if I may use that word, erupted in 1857, or considerable portions of the country, certainly. Right? But I also want to reiterate a few things which I had mentioned before and I want to discuss them in a slightly different framework. So when I was discussing for you British institutions, so I had talked about boarding schools or public schools, I had talked about clubs and hill stations, but you can also think about cemeteries. Cemeteries. One of the ways in which you can certainly study the history of the British in India is by going to churches in places such as Madras, modern-day Chennai, and go to the cemetery that you'll find in the church grounds. Why? Because you'll see tombstones of the British. And many of them, if you read the plaque, the inscription, you'll find that many of them died in their 20s. Late 20s, early 30s, mid-30s. Right? So that gives you a sense of what was happening there. And why is it that many of the British escaped to the hills? Because the plains were, as I said, places where you were likely to obviously, not just likely to, you would certainly face the heat, the intense searing heat of North India. Dust, much more likely to catch diseases over there, right? And so the plains was this, place of great contrast, right? But what the stones in the cemetery reveal is precisely how precarious life was. It's precarious for everyone, but it was certainly precarious for the British, who were certainly not prepared and were, if I may put it this way, constitutionally not adapted to the Indian climate, right? Now, and that is a way of doing social history. That when you go to these cemeteries, so one doesn't study history only through text, but one obviously studies it through various kinds of artifacts as well. And the cemetery is one of those kinds of artifacts, if I may put it this way. All right. So when we're talking about hill stations, what are we talking about? We're talking about, as I've already mentioned, relief from heat, disease, dust, epidemics. Hill stations are places which have restorative effect on your health, right? You try to recreate England over there, little England. You have gardens, and what do you grow in the garden? You grow such things as lettuce and parsley, which were never used which were not familiar to Indians, right? Not familiar. So you would grow things that reminded you of England, and of course you try to have English cuisine, whatever that might have been, which, as I've already remarked before, is almost nothing, frankly. But strawberries, for example, little details like that actually make these places come alive, because again, that's not really a fruit that would have been common in India at all. And so various kinds of strawberries, gooseberries, so forth and so on. This is what you would find in these hill stations, right? They were also nurseries of the ruling race. This is where young men and women would court each other. This is where the courting rituals took place. This is where racial segregation was to be found at its extreme. In Simla, so there's a hill station called Simla. Let me see if it's on this map here that I've shown you of hill stations. Yes, it is. Let me. So, if you in Simla, which is right here, see that over there. Okay. In Simla, Indians were not permitted, even on the Mall Road. I'm not talking about not being permitted in clubs, right? In private clubs, in the gymkhana, as it was called, right? The gymkhana was not just a private club, but it was usually a private club that would have tennis grounds, or and if it was a very spectacular one, there might be an accompanying polo ground there as well, right? So the gymkhana, the word related to the word gym that you have here, gymnasium, right? So in Simla, Indians were not even permitted on the Mall Road. And when Mohandas Gandhi, whom we're going to encounter towards the end of the course, otherwise known as Mahatma Gandhi, the chief architect of the Indian independence movement, when he was invited to Simla for negotiations with the British, and these were negotiations that would, in the very long run, lead to Indian independence, a number of Britishers became very upset because they made an exception for Gandhi so that he could travel on the Mall Road. All right? So this is the nature of that segregation that I'm really speaking about. And one of the very interesting things is that Shimla became, in fact, actually the summer capital of the British. So when the British moved their capital, again, something that we will take up much later on, because thus far, by the way, what is the capital of British India? It's Calcutta, right? It's Calcutta, or Kolkata as it's now called. It's Calcutta, which is here, obviously, in the east over here, right? Okay, it's not even marked here because it's not a hill station. This is a map of hill stations, right? So that was a capital. Then in the 20th century, it was shifted to Delhi. Delhi became the capital, okay, and Delhi is over here. So this is over here roughly, because these hill stations are all north of Delhi, and Shimla became the summer capital. Now, when I say it became the summer capital, what in effect happened was that the entire machinery of administration would actually move to Shimla for 4 or 5 months of the year, because the British just found it too hot to work in the plains. And Delhi especially is searing hot. And so all the files and all of these things would have to be moved. And then, of course, you have to think about the fact that they had to have a labor force for that. So these were these coolies, Indians who would carry, these files. Of course, they used mules as well. They used animals as well, but they would carry these files very often on their back. And there are interesting set of questions, was this basically a kind of forced labor? Were these people adequately compensated? If we were to do labor history, we would obviously look at those kinds of things as well. But this is simply by way of suggesting to you that the hill stations were not only repositories of British, social life, places where courting rituals took place, where the British recreated a little England, so forth and so on, but also there were places which were heavily invested as places of power, and particularly a place like Shimla. Yes?
Are the boarding schools there now at various places like in Shimla? Are they from the boarding schools that the British used to use?
Oh, yeah. In some cases, the schools have just continued, but now, of course, there's, by and large, an Indian administration. Although I have to tell you, by the way, that many of the boarding schools very often still like to have an administrator at the top, the principal, to be from Britain. Many of the schools, the most famous of them is the Doon School. Rajiv Gandhi, for example, Prime Minister of India at one point was a graduate of that school. But some of the schools, the most reputable ones, will still like to get, if they can, a Britisher to head that school. But these schools are completely Indianized now. Indianized in the sense that the students are all obviously Indians. You do get some foreign students, people coming from the Gulf countries, for example. But the vast majority of the students would be Indians. They're sexually segregated. Most of them will be either for boys or for girls. Very few of them which are co-ed. And they generally will follow a curriculum which has been established in India, not in Britain. Back then, of course, the curriculum would have been established back in Britain itself, right? So there are various kinds of changes that have taken place, but the students who go to boarding school tend to belong to the anglicized elite. There are non-resident Indians. I'm speaking about Indian Americans in this country who send their children once in a while to these boarding schools too, because they want them to grow up in India. They want them to not grow up in America, so they don't get contaminated, by drugs and sex and whatever else, right? There's this notion that still persists. Yes.
While the capital was still in Calcutta, was there a hill station that was used in the same way?
Well, Darjeeling. But Darjeeling, which is up here, but it wasn't. It didn't have the status that Shimla had. No, the idea of the summer capital, so Darjeeling is the place that you would escape to But the idea of a summer capital, which would become the seat of administration, this is a role that really Simla played. It's a role that Simla played. Yeah. Yes.
Just a quick question. With the obviously, British rule, it was it developed and expanded over time. So, would you say later these people that went to the boarding school?
Yes.
Would you say did they form the majority or like a sizable part of this sort of administration, or were still sort of many leading officials still came from Britain? Like how did the whole?
I wouldn't say that at all. In fact, actually, one of the most arresting things about you see, there's several ways one can answer it. If you look at the top echelon of Indian nationalists, for example, they don't come from the boarding schools. The vast majority of them went to England to acquire a law degree. Okay, yeah. Well, or London, the Inner Temple, the Middle Temple, right, the Inns of Law. They would acquire a law degree in Britain. The vast majority of Indian nationalists, if you look at Jawaharlal Nehru, Mohandas Gandhi, the two most well-known names, but I could reel off 50 other names, and virtually all of them had law degrees, but they did not go to boarding schools for the most part. Nehru is an exception. But Nehru did not go to a boarding school in India. He went to one in Britain. Okay, all right. So there are various exceptions there. But Gandhi, for example, is schooled entirely in India until the time that he goes to London to acquire a law degree. Now, your question also is, well, what about the top levels of Indian administration? Again, the answer is, for the most part, no. These are not people who are graduates of the boarding schools, because at that time, remember also that that most of these boarding schools would have been, in fact, actually not Indians. It would have been Britishers. It's only after independence, after 1947, that you obviously are going to get a fundamental sea change there, and the students are going to start to be Indians. Now, there were colleges for princes. Mayo College is a good illustration of that. Mayo College is in Rajasthan, in Western India, over here, right? And this was a college where you found the Indian aristocratic elite were sending their children over there, all right? But most of them were not people who really went into the civil services. Because look at it this way. Your question, we can answer it at various levels of complexity. The aristocratic elite are not the kind of people who are going to go into civil services, because leisure is important for them. To go into the civil services means you have to work. The idea of working is only for people who are middle class or plebeian. And this is not the time for this. Even in the United States in the 19th century, I can furnish you a quote from Lincoln, who argued that the idea of work, in fact, was something that was actually something that was really only for a class of people who were plebeians. All right, people of integrity and dignity do not work. You do not work for a living, so to speak. All right. So these considerations are important, because the Indians who would go into the civil service, which is much later on, because for many years the Indians were excluded, and to give you, by the way, an indication of the difficulties for Indians to enter into the civil service, you know that an Indian, and I'm talking about now the second half of the 19th century, when it even became possible for Indians to enter into the civil service, so late 19th century, late 1800s, an Indian who wanted to enter the civil service had to pass the exam. But this exam could only be taken in London. So the Indian would have to go into London to be able to sit for this exam, so that if he were admitted into the civil service, he could then help in running his own country. And I'm using his here because there were no women taking the exam at that juncture in any case, right? So, but think of it, that you had to actually take this exam in Britain. Now, this also meant, of course, that you had to be coming by and large from a family of some means in order to be able to do that. And in some cases, very, very few cases, the native princes would actually offer patronage. The best illustration of that is a man who we will encounter much later on, briefly, exceedingly important person for the history of independent India, B.R. Ambedkar. who's going to be the leader of the Dalits. So he comes from a very low caste background. People like him would, ordinarily never have been educated at all. But he's going to come, and I'm talking now here about the 20th century. I'm talking about 1920s. He's going to come to Columbia University, but he has the patronage of an Indian ruler, which is what makes it possible for him to come. But look, let's not get too detained by these kinds of details. The other way that you can think about this is you can think about what I'm going to call the productivity principle and the leisure principle, that the plains were the place that exemplified the productivity principle. So this is where the English thought of themselves as, performing the work of empire. And you get this heroic kind of portrait of the Englishman on his horse going from district to district in the heat, doing the work of empire. And the hills were the places that in some ways exemplified what you could call the leisure principle. Right? This is where and certainly English women and children would generally spend a much longer period of time in the hills than they would in the plains. Yes?
How do you spell the summer capital?
Shimla. Shimla, also spelled Simla. Yeah, without the H. Yeah. All right. So that's a broad sweep of the social life of the British in India. We've talked about a certain number of institutions. We've talked about certain kinds of amusements. Certain sports, for example, polo, pig-sticking, cricket, hunting. We've talked about racial segregation, that this had become a principal feature, certainly from the 1820s, 1830s onwards, and that these very institutions, such as the public school, the boarding school, the club, and the hill station itself, were in fact places where you could see this racial segregation very, very clearly, at work. All right. Now, the segment that we're moving into now is, so on the syllabus what you have actually for today, but I'm not really going to be speaking about that today because I want to introduce 2 or 3 different trajectories. So the 2 or 3 different trajectories I want to introduce is, one is the political economy of the British in India, and that's technically what's on the syllabus for today. The second one is the rebellion of 1857, 1858. And this is very often considered sort of the midpoint in many ways of the British in India, because 1757 is the Battle of Plassey, so it's exactly 100 years. In fact, some people thought even at that time that perhaps the rebellion had broken out at that juncture, because it marked in some ways 100 years of the ascendancy of the British in India. I doubt, by the way, that was really that important, that it was the 100th year of the British in India, because many of the rebels certainly were not thinking in those terms. However, in order to understand the rebellion of 1857-58, one has to first think of a number of other things. And this introduces a new segment, and that is, in fact, the history of resistance in India, the history of resistance. Because, I mean, if you think about it, thus far, what I've been talking about, and might have conveyed the impression, it was certainly a critique of Edward Said that he conveyed this impression, that colonial rule, whether it was in India or anywhere else, was something that was totalizing, that it had this enormous, overwhelming impact, and introduced in some ways a paralysis among the people who were being ruled. Well, how did they accept that rule? Did they resist it in various ways? And of course one can, and so the argument that has been given against Said, Orientalism, was precisely that he seemed to think that agency always belonged only on one side. It belonged on the side of the colonizer. What about the colonized? Now, there is a long history of insurrections, revolts, jacqueries, that is various forms of resistance to colonial rule in India. There was a mutiny that took place, for example, in a place called Vellore. How about now? Is it okay? All right. Okay, so, the history of this resistance is very often written simply as the history of this or that revolt, here or there. Right? I mean, I mentioned the revolt to you in Vellore, the mutiny in Vellore in the early 1800s, 1807 I think it was, somewhere around that time. But there are different ways of writing it too. Let me offer you a very simple illustration. And I'll give you a different illustration as well from a different context. And again, you don't have to necessarily go along with my interpretation of it. George Orwell, the author of Animal Farm, 1984. George Orwell, by the way, was born in India, in a place called Motihari, which is also the place where the Indians who contributed to fingerprinting came from. So it's a little place in Bihar, in North India, born as Eric Blair. So one of his lesser-known books, which I read when I was about 18 or 19, and I still remember this episode vividly, down to the present day. The book is called Down and Out in London and Paris. So it's a time when he was a young man, he was kind of a hobo in a way, down and out. That expression itself should tell you something. And he was essentially trying to make his way in life, long before he became well-known and became a famous writer. And so, for those of you who know George Orwell, you know that he's a writer with distinctly socialist inclinations, right? So one of the things he talks about in the book was this kind of resentment he had against people who were really rich. And one of the places that he worked in was a restaurant, and this was a higher-end restaurant. And so Orwell says that, when he started working there as a waiter, he became extremely annoyed because, he would go and serve these dishes and he would chance upon a conversation, and he thought that these rich people, their conversations were utterly trivial for the most part, and in some cases highly offensive. And so he says that one of the things that he would do sometimes is that before he would take the soup in to the man, he would spit into it. Okay, he would spit into it. Now you might think to yourself, this is barbaric, it's absurd. Certainly if an Indian had done it, we would have been told that it's barbaric and these people are uncouth and they have no manners. But here's a respectable, highly respectable author in the West who talking about how he felt. And you might think that, well, this is just envy on his part, No, but you see, you can also read it as a mode of resistance. There's a very famous writer, James Scott, an anthropologist at Yale, who has written a number of books on everyday forms of resistance, the arts of resistance. Resistance is not simply when you pick up a sword or a rifle and lunge at somebody. No, they can be resistance can take various forms, right? So the illustration from India that I would give you, and I could give many such illustrations, but I think this is a way for you to reflect upon what we mean when we speak about resistance. That one of the modalities I've talked about is the survey modality. And what did the survey modality involve? It involved people who would go out and survey the land. Cartographers, surveyors. Now, there are various instruments that surveyors use. And many of the surveyors mentioned that their instruments would often be stolen. The instruments that they took. Now, these are highly specialized instruments. So if you're a simple villager or a peasant, you really have no use for that instrument. It's not something that you can use. It's different than stealing a person's wallet, and if there's money in it, well, anybody can use it. These are highly specialized instruments. And so the surveyor would say, this villager stole it because what he's going to do is, he's going to melt these instruments and then, or just sell it as raw steel or whatever the case might be. Right? Recycling, so to speak. But what the surveyor did not reflect upon was that, well, if you are a villager, your land is being surveyed by a surveyor, and is being surveyed from the point of view of trying to increase your revenue assessment, because if you're going to make a revenue assessment, first you have to know how much land does this person have. How much land does this person have? Why should we not think that the person who was stealing the instruments was in fact doing so deliberately because he did not want his land in fact to be measured, that this was a mode of resistance to a certain form of inquiry by the British? Right? That's what I mean when I say that we're going to have to think about what we really mean by resistance, what are everyday forms of resistance. And everyday forms of resistance took place, of course, in the household all the time, in interactions between the Britishers and the servants that they had. When the servants would fail to perform their duties, when they failed to do so, of course, the Britisher would say, the lazy native never follows the instructions. By the way, this is how the Indian middle class still thinks about its servants today, for the most part. They always think when the work is not being done, lazy native. Right? Of course, they don't use that phrase, but that's exactly, or that these people are ignorant, they're illiterate. They don't have the Protestant work ethic. And they don't have the Protestant work ethic. This was the problem with them. But, of course, they're not thinking that, well, perhaps this is one of the ways in which a person who's working in a British household is exercising his or her resistance. How will women resist, for example? Patriarchy, right? And one of the ways in which women have done it over a very long period of time is to, in fact, exercise that resistance in the domain of the kitchen, because that was the domain to which they were very often restricted. If you read medieval history, you find that that's very much the case. Right? So I want you to think of that. I don't want you to think simply of, as it were, political forms of resistance in the overt sense of the term. All right? Now, 1857, 1858, there are some general considerations that we have to think about. All right? So the first I've already mentioned to you, that there is a previous history of this. The second, which is not mentioned over here, but that's because I'm going to take it up again in detail when I look at the whole question of the political economy of colonialism. The second has to do with the fact that there was a general sense of social political anomie in India. Anomie meaning a certain kind of uneasiness, disorder that we have to really think about, which commences much earlier. It commences much earlier. Severe forms of economic dislocation. What would be an illustration of this severe form of economic dislocation? Something that is usually not mentioned in the histories of the political economy of the British in India, because it's seen as a different subject, but in fact it gives you clues into what was going on. And that is the massive outward migration of Indians beginning in 1830s, mid-1830s, and continuing all the way until the 1870s, 1880s. And I'm talking here about a phenomenon which is known as indentured labor. I did speak about this before. This is now the place to reiterate what the significance of this is. Because if you have an outward migration, think of migration today. Why do people migrate? Right? You very often migrate in order to improve your economic prospects. But if you look at refugees, you look at Syrian refugees. I mean, these are people who are incapable of making a home, much less having a livelihood now. Right? I just finished reading a book called Cast Away, which is a beautifully written book about 6 or 7 different refugees and follows their lives, coming from different parts of the world, all trying to get into Europe. None of them trying to get into the U.S. I mean, we're constantly told about, the refugees who are pouring in. The U.S. actually takes very, very few refugees in comparison to most countries in the world. Certainly in Europe, not to mention Jordan, which has taken over a million Syrian refugees. All right. So what are we talking about here? What we're talking about is the fact that these Indians began to migrate in the mid-1830s. Now, and I do not want to really speak of them as migrants, because migrants very often are people who leave of their own volition. You leave from your choice. Now, of course, to some degree, they did leave from choice, because for the million who left, there are 50 million who didn't. Correct? So to that extent, you could say, yes, they left out of their choice. But the question is, what are the circumstances that pushed them? This is old immigration theory, by the way, if you have to think about it, push and pull factors, as they often, I'm just using this for the sake of convenience. What are the factors that impelled these people to leave? And what impelled them to leave was the fact that India had become an exceedingly inhospitable place to most of its own people. You simply couldn't make a living from the land. Most of these people are peasants, or they're laborers. Right? And why is it that they go to Trinidad in the Caribbean? And that's an extraordinary phenomenon in itself, which I cannot take up over here. I'm teaching a class next quarter, incidentally, on the Indian diaspora, worldwide Indian diaspora. And we look at indentured labor in considerable detail. Because you have to think about it. I mean, the vast majority of these people who left would have been illiterate. Many of them would never have gone more than 100 kilometers from their natal home, from their birthplace. And now, 6 months later, you suddenly land up in the Caribbean, or you land up in Fiji. I mean, imagine what that entails, right? How did they actually, in some ways, navigate this passage? And I don't mean literally the passage, but how did they navigate the passage from one world to another world? Interesting set of questions in itself. But they went to Trinidad, they went to Guyana, first to the Caribbean, and Mauritius. Very different terrain, right? Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, they went to the Caribbean, and then over the years we're going to find that they're going to be going to places such as Fiji and Malaysia. Right? And the indentured laborers, they're called indentured laborers because when they went to the Caribbean, what had happened in the Caribbean? The abolition of slavery. Now, when the abolition of slavery occurred there, so you know that the Caribbean, even if you haven't been there, I'm sure most of you know that what you had was sugar plantations. And it was, of course, African slaves who were working on these sugar plantations. But when slavery was abolished, in the first half of the 19th century, the plantation owners found that, well, they needed a labor force. It's a long and complicated story, so if somebody were trying to pin down the accuracy, I'm just giving you general, the most important ingredients of that without giving you any of the nuances of what's involved here. But the gist of it is that the Africans who now became free put a price on their labor to work on this, which was a price that many plantation owners were unwilling to give. Right? So, but if you don't have a labor force, you're going to get ruined. Now, India was already by the 1820s, 1830s, had long been already at that point a British colony. Right? Certainly, large chunks of India had already fallen under British rule. So, what these plantation owners in effect did was they essentially, working through the government of India and the government back in London itself, they were able to get an agreement from the government of India that a certain number of Indians would now supply the labor force. So these Indians go to places like Trinidad and Guyana and Suriname and Jamaica and Barbados, and then eventually to other places such as Fiji, also a sugar colony. Malaysia was not sugar, Malaysia was rubber plantations, but they're plantations, cash crops. And these Indians will initially go on a contract of 5 years, so that's what that phrase indentured means. You indenture yourself. Some historians have argued that it was essentially a new form of slavery. That's what it was. Slavery under a different name, because there were severe restrictions on the mobility of these Indians when they arrived in Trinidad and were then eventually taken to a sugar plantation. There were restrictions on their mobility. Many of these men came as single men. Right? So you see that some of the patterns are the patterns that you would often see with migrants in general. Right? But this is the history I'm talking about. And I'm saying that we have to think about why is it that they left. And they left because the prospects in India for them were extremely dim, extremely dire. Right? And this itself, I think, is a testament to the failure of the British to be able to, in fact, furnish employment prospects to the Indians. And there is an argument which we will take up later on, and that argument has to do with what is called the deindustrialization of India, that it has been argued by some scholars, and there are differences of opinion about this, but it has been argued by some scholars that under the British, India actually was deindustrialized, that the kinds of capacity that India had before in the arenas of manufacturing, not just in the domain of textile, but in other domains as well, that in fact this is going to get severely diminished. All right? So there's that set of considerations. Now, when we look at the rebellion of 1857, 1858, okay, one thing that we must bear in mind, and this is generally true of all insurrections and rebellions of this magnitude. In fact, I would say it's true even of much smaller revolts or disturbances. Something that comes to mind, because I've looked at it in some detail, is what happened in Los Angeles when you had the Rodney King riots, for those few of you might know about it. Now, what exactly am I adverting to here? What I'm adverting to is the following circumstance. That the rebellion of 1857-58 was rooted in a number of historical considerations, which we will turn to momentarily. A number of historical considerations, such as this kind of economic dislocation, resentment at the fact that racial sentiments had become very prominent. So obviously some Indians resented this kind of racism, right? And many others. And we'll turn to each of these. But what I want you to think about is this, that when a rebellion breaks out of this magnitude, or even smaller, many people who are not political creatures, who don't have those kinds of political grievances, will jump into it as well. You have personal scores. You are a peasant living in a little village, and you own your money lender a large sum of money. You're a peasant, you've taken out a loan. Why have you taken out a loan? Because your daughter is about to get married. And you have to be able to furnish a dowry for your daughter. And you don't have the means to do that. So what do? You go to the local money lender and you borrow some of money. Many of these money lenders were quite notorious because no matter how much you paid back, it seemed that you never paid back the loan. Right? That is, that the money lender is doctoring the books, right? Manipulating the account books. And many of the people who are taking these loans are illiterate villagers. A problem that one had to think about, because very often, you know how these transactions were done. You're a peasant, you go to the money lender, you take a loan, and you don't know how to sign your name, and he just says, put a thumbprint on this piece of paper in lieu of a signature, and you don't know what the person has written on that. So now when this rebellion breaks out, you are a peasant. You're absolutely clueless about what the British are doing, but you do know that your money lender has been exploiting you, and you'd love to get rid of him, and you certainly would love to see his books burnt down so that he cannot use that as evidence against you. Right? So you join the rebellion. You commit an act of arson. I hope you understand what I'm saying. That we should not assume that everyone who was implicated in the 1857, 1858 disturbances, right, was rebel who was thinking in political categories only. By the way, resentment against your moneylender is also a political act of resistance, no question about it, but it was not necessarily resistance to the British. I mean, one can think of it in a very complicated fashion, because then one might have to think about what was the relationship between the moneylenders and the British. Why is it that the British were not doing enough to repress these moneylenders, so forth and so on, right? One could look at that chain, as it were. But what I'm suggesting here is that what begins as a Sepoy mutiny, and I'll explain that to you. When I say Sepoy mutiny, what I'm talking about is a mutiny in the army of the East India Company, in the Bengal army of the East India Company. That is how it really started. Right? So that's why it's called a Sepoy. A Sepoy is the foot soldier. Right? All the Sepoys were Indians. So what begins as a Sepoy mutiny is going to become something much larger. And this is why I gave the analogy, although the scale here is much smaller, with the Rodney King riots of 1992 in Los Angeles, because one shouldn't think that everyone who joined in that was necessarily joining in because of a political resentment about what had happened to Rodney King and the brutality of the LAPD. Right? That if there is a disturbance, people will join in and they'll see, there's an occasion to loot a store. Why not? Carry away 2 Samsung TVs or whatever it is. This is a scenario that you do have to think about when you're thinking about 1857-58. All right? And continuing with this general set of considerations about the rebellion of 57-58, one of the most striking things is the brutal suppression of the mutiny by the British. No quarter given on either side. There was brutality on both sides. Brutality on both sides, but again, they're interesting limits. And what do I mean by that? So one of the things that was argued by the British, this became a widespread rumor, was that English women had been sexually assaulted by the rebels. Right? And there was a widespread rumor about this. And so at the end of the rebellion in 1858, the then Governor General, Lord Canning, appointed, you should know what by now, a committee, right, to inquire into these rumors. Was there any substance? The committee came up with a conclusion there was absolutely no substance to the rumors at all. No substance to the rumors at all. They couldn't find any instance of English women who had been sexually assaulted. That's not because Indians are saints. I mean, they're willing to murder, but this was a limit. Right, so because, as I said, no quarter given, so the rebels, they're English women and children who were going to be killed as well in the rebellion of 1857-58. But the integrity, the sexual integrity, in any case, of English women was still respected. Right? So one gets into various aspects of this, and one would, have to try to understand that even when we say that, well, there was a brutal suppression of the mutiny by the British, and that the Indians themselves actually engaged in brutal conduct very often, but nonetheless, at least in some respects, some limits were observed. Whether they were observed by the British is also an interesting question that we would have to take up. And in my next lecture, I'm going to show you some slides of what really transpired in 1857-1858. All right. For example, mutineers blown away by cannon. So, if they caught a rebel, one of the punishments that was inflicted on the rebel was they would tie the body to the cannon, and then they would fire the cannon from the back, and then the body would just fly into the air and break up into hundreds of pieces. Right? So we know that this was in fact actually done. Another larger consideration that we have, so that enables us to think about the context, is and something that I have not even remotely hinted at thus far, except when I spoke, although I did not mention it specifically in that context. I mean, I talked about very briefly the Anglo-Afghan Wars, if you recall, when I was talking about British expansion, right, in the Indian subcontinent. I talked about the Anglo-Afghan Wars, and I talked about the Anglo-Burmese Wars. Now, the implication of that, which I want you to think about, is that the armies of the East India Company, and then after 1858, the Army of British India was in fact an army that was used to police the entire British Empire. Right? The British would very often use Indian troops to put down resistance elsewhere in the empire. In Aden, in what are now called the Gulf states, in that region, sometimes in Africa. And if you were to broaden this out, India's contribution to World War I and World War II was extremely significant. And of course, this is highly ironical because India itself is a country that is being colonized. And yet, over 60,000 Indians lost their lives in World War I fighting on behalf of the British. Because when Britain went to war in World War I, World War II is a little more complicated story, which we'll turn to when we get to nationalism. But World War I, 1914, 1918, when Britain went to war, it meant that all of Britain's colonies were now also at war with Germany. Right? That's what it meant. And so, in fact, we're going to find that a large number of Indians, in fact, over 1 million Indians, in fact, actually fought in World War I. And 60,000 of them died. Many of them died in places like Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Right? And of course, one has to really reflect on the significance of that because what we're really talking about is the fact that people who were themselves being subjugated and colonized are now, in fact, being deployed to fight Britain's wars. In World War II, the story becomes more complicated because by then, of course, you had a full-blown nationalist movement, right? And there was a position that was taken up by the Indians. Yes, you had a question.
Yeah, during the Sepoy Rebellion, were there also Indians that were fighting against
Fighting against?
That were fighting with the British to put down the rebellion?
Oh yeah, because the armies of the East India Company were largely comprised of Indian soldiers.
So
Essentially, so when we're speaking about the mutiny, that's why it's called a mutiny, because it's within the ranks of the army itself, right? So the East India Company has what's called the Bengal Army, then there's a Madras Army down in the south, right? And most of the rebellion, as we're going to see when I show you some slides, is going to take place in North India. The territory that's going to be affected is North India. It's going to the bulk of the fighting is Indians working for the army of the East India Company fighting the Indian rebels. Now, the artillery was always in the hands of the British for obvious reasons, right? For obvious reasons, because the artillery is the most obviously potent, right, weapon you have within your arsenal. You cannot turn the artillery over to the Indians in your own army because they could turn it against you. And usually the cavalry was almost always again British. So you've got the infantry, you've got the cavalry, and you've got the artillery, right? And the artillery, 100% managed by the British. The artillery officers, the people who would actually, feed the cannons, all of that, right? And then the cavalry largely. And we're going to find that will change, obviously, as one goes on in time into the late 1800s, moving into the 1900s, and so on. Right? So what I'm speaking about here, what is the context I'm talking about? I'm talking about the fact that if you look at the rebellion of 1857, I'm saying its significance was in many ways geopolitical. It's geopolitical because if you are unable to repress the rebellion, it's not simply that you stand to lose India, you stand to lose an army which is in fact actually doing the work of foot soldiers for the entire empire. Right? That's the context, and you have to think about it, that India's contribution to colonial wars, right? Colonial wars of expansion elsewhere by the British, and World War I and II, that one doesn't usually think of it in the context of 1857, but I'm suggesting that to try to understand the geopolitical implications, one would have to understand that. Now, there are many other ways in which the geopolitical implications of this of the rebellion of 1857-58 have been understood. But we would have to start moving into a larger set of questions which I really cannot entertain, even larger than what I've done thus far. For example, what is the relationship between this and the years shortly thereafter and the American Civil War? You'd have to look at what happens to cotton, for example. All right. But let's go back to this slide over here where I'm talking about the supreme importance of India to the British at this point. The view of somebody like Churchill, much later on in the 20th century, of course, was that if you lost India, if Britain lost India, essentially it would cease to be a world power. And I think he's unquestionably right about that. He was unquestionably right in many ways, which is one reason why somebody like Churchill, in any case, displayed an extraordinary tenacity in wanting to hold on, to the empire. And then there are other considerations, such as the fact that India provided the ruling class for colonies elsewhere. The people who went on, the British elite who went on to rule in places such as Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, the vast bulk of that top echelon had all acquired experience in India first. Right? They had all acquired experience in India. So India, in that sense, was now going to provide the ruling class in many ways of the British Empire. It's not the Indians, but India as a field itself that was going to provide the ruling class for British colonies elsewhere. Right? And incidentally, places such as Burma and Aden, the Gulf states, they were actually ruled from India, not from London, right? In the 19th century, moving into the 20th century. So that's the broader picture. Now, before we look at the causes, and I won't finish with that today. I'll continue with this in my following lecture, and then also turn to the questions of political economy. But if you look at this map over here, so you can see from the key over there, the states that were loyal to the British with army in the rebellion, that's states over here in this dark kind of purple, very dark blue purple over here. And then what you see, states aiding the British. So whenever we say states aiding the British, these are what? Native states. These are native states. Right? I've talked about the native states on a number of occasions, and because recall that even at the height of their rule, the British had elected not to rule all of India directly. Right? They had these subsidiary alliances with native rulers, a treaty where the ruler would have a certain degree of autonomy, and this autonomy would extend to such subjects as education for his or her subjects. Irrigation, so forth and so on. But these native states did not have the autonomy to enter into agreements with foreign countries. Right? That's real sovereignty. They had autonomy, but not sovereignty. Right? That might be one way to understand the distinction. So some of these native states actually would came to the aid of the British. And the areas that were affected by rebellion, British areas affected by rebellion, so I've said to you that the rebellion was something that took place largely in North India. This is what I mean by North India here. You don't find that these areas were affected at all. And there's a whole set of questions about why they were not affected, partly because because it started as a mutiny in the army, the Bengal army of the East India Company, and the Bengal army's jurisdiction would have extended over here, but also because the dislocation, some people have argued, although I think this is actually questionable to some degree, that the dislocation created by the British was not as acute over here. For example, the permanent settlement, this is Bengal here, right? It says Bengal. The permanent settlement, which the British wrought in 1793. In 1793, when they created a whole class of zamindars, a whole class of landlords. This kind of dislocation that came in the wake of the permanent settlement, because recall one of the stipulations of this permanent settlement was that you fix the revenue, but if you're unable to pay the revenue, then your land can become alienated. It can be sold. And it's been estimated that up to 1/3 of all the zamindars forfeited their land in Bengal within a couple of decades. Now, in the south, the manner in which the revenue in the Madras presidency here, for example, the manner in which revenue was adjudicated was quite different, because the British basically came to agreement with the individual cultivator. So it's called the Royotwari system. What has simply been argued, without getting into the nuances of the argument, is that the dislocation created in the south was much less considerable than it was in North India. One way you can measure that is you'd look at where the outward migration is taking place from. That's one way in which you can attempt to understand that. And it is certainly true that the majority of the migrants, I'm talking about the indentured laborers, right? Majority of them came from the Gangetic Plains. So the Ganga flows through over here, right? That's why it's called the Gangetic Plains. And they came from Bihar, UP, modern-day Bihar and UP, from this area over here. And incidentally, when they left for the Caribbean or wherever, what they would do is they would go to Calcutta, because that was a port. Later on, you're going to find some leaving from Bombay as well from over here. But generally, you left from Calcutta. Right, and we're going to find that there are going to be indentured laborers who are going to be leaving from South India, but this is going to be much later on. So the ones who go to Malaysia, for example, are largely from South India. So if anyone here has been to Malaysia, to places like KL, Kuala Lumpur, or Penang, you would know that there's a considerable Tamil-speaking population, because they all come from here, So there, it's not Bollywood, but it's Tamil cinema that is very big in that part. All right. So this map gives you a sense of the general terrain of this revolt. Okay. Now, what is it that led to this rebellion of 1857? So you can think about, I remember when I was growing up in India, we would read in the textbooks that the reason why it happened is because the army decided to introduce these new rifles, Enfield rifles, and to fire the rifle, what you had to do was you had to bite off a piece of the cartridge. And they put either beef fat or pork fat. Now, if you want to do something dumb, that's what you do, because if you were a Hindu, the cow is, sacred to you. There's a taboo on the consumption of beef, and obviously beef fat, beef broth, all of that. And if you're a Muslim, obviously the consumption of pork is absolute taboo, right? So what we were told, and I'm not saying that this is not a factor, I'm not saying that, but obviously something of this kind is rooted in much deep-seated causes, right? But so that when the sepoys, the soldiers, took offense because they got contaminated, they got polluted in having to fire these rifles. All right. So this was now I think the modern day reading of this is that we cannot think of this as a cause, obviously, of the rebellion, but we can think of this as something like a catalyst, the match that lit the fire that was waiting to be lit, right? Cartridges using cow and pig fat. However, moving on to more substantive assessment of the rebellion of 1857. One of the things I've talked about, and I need not reiterate it now, is the increasing racial sentiment and racial divide, which was certainly, I think, a cause of resentment for many Indians. Secondly, and I want to dwell on this for a few minutes, is the policies pursued quite aggressively by the Governor General of India at that time, a man by the name of Dalhousie. There is a hill station in North India, it's called Dalhousie. It's one of the more beautiful hill stations, so it's named after this Governor General. All right? And Dalhousie was perhaps, certainly if you're looking at the 30, 40 years preceding him, the most aggressive of the Governor Generals, particularly with respect to the policies of annexation that he pursued. Now, when I speak about annexation, what I'm speaking about is the British resolve, leading eventually to the action of annexation, the resolve to absorb the territories of certain native rulers into their dominions. Right? So you already know the distinction between native states and the territories of British India. And these territories of British India grew partly through military expansion, through wars of expansion. The best illustration of that being in the time immediately preceding Dalhousie would be the wars of expansion in the Punjab. When Maharaja Ranjit Singh died, 1839, 1840, around that time, then what do we find? That finally the British are going to say that, all right, we're going to try to see if we can absorb the territories of the Punjab, and that's when you get the Anglo-Sikh Wars. Right? The first of the Anglo-Sikh Wars. It's going to take them several years, but that's a war of military expansion. Now, annexation usually did not involve a war of military expansion. So what were the grounds on which the annexation took place? And when this annexation took place, by the way, in some cases there was a history that went back 10, 15, 20, 25, 50 years. 50 years sometimes. Many of the documents which justify the British annexation of an Indian state, many of these documents were penned by no lesser a person than the great philosopher of liberty, John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill. He wrote most of the documents that justified. Why? Because he was working for the office of the Examiner of Correspondence at the East India Company. Right? I had mentioned this before. Now think of what role he's playing. And remember that his most famous essay, the classic that everyone reads, is his essay on liberty. Because Mill certainly took the view, by the way, that there were people who were not fit to rule themselves. Indians being among those who were not fit to rule themselves. Some who have been more charitably inclined towards Mill have argued that he certainly accepted the possibility that they might be fit to rule themselves one day. So he has a book also called, which is not read as much as On Liberty, but I would recommend that you take a look at it at some point if you're interested in these questions, because the question has to do with the limits of liberalism, the limits of the liberal imagination here. And this book is called Considerations on Representative Government, where he talks at some length about what is representative government, and at what point do people deserve a representative government, and what shape would it take, so forth and so on. Now, Mill was the person who would eventually write the final document, so to speak, that would justify the annexation. What were the grounds on which the annexation took place? There were basically two grounds. What is called the Doctrine of Lapse, and what is called the Doctrine of Paramountcy. All right? The Doctrine of Lapse is very simple. Well, it's simple at one level, namely that the British did not recognize adoptions by native rulers. So you have a native ruler. Jhansi is a native state. And the ruler of that state does not have a biological male heir to the throne. He has a daughter, but not a male heir to the throne. And so what would very often the native ruler do? The native ruler would then adopt a adopt a male child, right? In some of these states, they had no problem. Women could ascend to the throne, right? But the British view was that, well, no, we don't recognize female adoptions. Female heirs to the throne, right? We don't recognize female heirs to the throne. So what the native ruler would do is they would in fact actually adopt a male child who would then be placed on the throne. But the British did not recognize these adoptions as legal. Okay, they did not recognize these adoptions as legal, and I'll get to in a second. And the doctrine of lapse means that in such instances, the state would lapse. It would cease to exist. Right? That is, that it warranted the intervention of the British. And so it was then absorbed into the British territories. Yes?
Victoria was the queen at this
Yeah.
time. How did they rationalize?
Well, this is not really a subject that's taken up in the documents, but you're absolutely right. And of course, there is a history of female sovereigns on the throne in Britain, because before Victoria there was, of course, Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, right? Okay, so there are a number of instances, but even in Britain, it's kind of complicated because, for example, you do know that the consort of the king is always a queen, but the consort of the queen is not a king. All right. So, for example, the Duke of Edinburgh, who's the husband of Elizabeth now, the monarch, he's not called king. He's never called king. Never. Right? But the wife of a king is automatically a queen. Right? So there are all kinds of discrepancies that one can really get into. Right? So that's the doctrine of lapse. Now, Jhansi, I give the illustration of Jhansi. Jhansi is a state in what is today called Madhya Pradesh, central India, and the Rani of Jhansi, the queen of Jhansi, ascends to the throne. But the British are going to annex Jhansi. And so when we say annex, it means now simply that the British saying this state has ceased to exist. It is now going to be absorbed into the territories of British India. The second doctrine that was used, this was more widespread because the number of cases where you would have the lack of a male heir to a biological male heir to the throne were obviously limited. The second one was more widespread, was the doctrine of paramountcy. Now, the doctrine of paramountcy simply means that the British say that we are the paramount power, the principal power. Right? We are the principal power. What are the implications of that? The implications is, so let's take the case of Awadh. Right? This is a state that was going to be absorbed by the British in 1856, just before the rebellion of 1857. Now, with Awadh, they had had a subsidiary alliance for a long period of time. Awadh is an extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary place to try to understand some of the complexities of British Indian engagement, because Awadh was a state where the British argued the ruler was an Oriental despot. He was an Oriental despot. The last ruler of Awadh was a man called Wajid Ali Shah. And the typical British representation of Wajid Ali Shah is that, well, what is Wajid Ali Shah's day like? Oh, the man wakes up at 10 in the morning. He's a ruler of a state. That was how they represented it. He wakes up at 10 in the morning. He has a leisurely breakfast. Then he goes to the rooftop, and what does he do? He flies kites. Kite flying was a great thing in Awadh, Lucknow, modern-day Lucknow. He goes and flies kites. Then he comes back. It's time for lunch. Then after a leisurely lunch, after the lunch, he has... What do you do in the heat in India in the afternoon on a summer day? You take a nap, a long nap, 2-3 hours. Then he wakes up, it's about 5, it's time for tea. Then he goes and sees cockfighting, which was a great passion over there, cockfighting, right? so forth and so on. And then, of course, in the evening, it's time for debauchery, right? He has a harem of several hundred women, so forth and so on. This is what an Oriental despot do. He is neglecting his subjects. He is neglecting his land. Therefore, he has forfeited his right to rule. We have the moral right as a paramount power to take over and put this place in order. In short, that is the doctrine of paramountcy. All right, I will stop here and I will resume this narrative in my next lecture.